In 2002, a man walked out of a meeting in Moscow after being quoted roughly $8 million for a refurbished intercontinental ballistic missile. On the flight home, instead of accepting that rockets simply cost what rockets cost, he opened a spreadsheet and started listing the raw materials a rocket is actually made of: aluminum, titanium, copper, carbon fiber. He added up the market price of the metal. The materials came to roughly 2% of what he had just been quoted. Most people, faced with a price they cannot afford, conclude they cannot afford it. He concluded that the price was arbitrary, a convention the industry had accumulated over decades, not a law of physics. 20 years later, the company he built from that spreadsheet launches more mass into orbit than every other organization on the planet combined. We tend to explain outcomes like this with a single word: genius, as though there is a scalar quantity called intelligence, and some people simply have more of it, and everything else follows. But that explanation doesn't survive contact with the evidence. There are tens of thousands of people alive right now with higher measured intelligence than any famous founder. Almost none of them have built anything. Raw processing power is not the variable that separates these outcomes. The variable is what the processor is pointed at and what it refuses to accept as fixed. So today I want to reverse engineer that, not the man. I have no access to anyone's interior life, and neither does anyone making these videos. What we do have is 25 years of public record, documented decisions, stated reasoning, and outcomes we can measure. From that record, you can extract something closer to an operating system than a personality. And unlike genius, an operating system is something you can actually examine. Here's the first component, and it's the one the Moscow story illustrates. Most human reasoning runs on analogy. We decide what to do by looking at what similar people did in similar situations and adjusting slightly. This is not laziness. It is enormously efficient. Analogical reasoning lets you make 1,000 decisions a day at almost no cognitive cost. And it is right most of the time, because the world is mostly stable and the past is mostly a good guide. The alternative is reasoning from first principles, stripping a problem down to the things you're confident are true and rebuilding upward without importing anyone's conclusions. This is how physics is taught, and it is spectacularly expensive. It is slow, it is effortful, and it produces a worse answer than analogy in the overwhelming majority of cases, because most of the time the accumulated convention is accumulated for good reason. But in the rare case where the convention is wrong, analogical reasoning cannot detect it. Not slowly, never. If everyone in your industry inherited the same assumption, comparing yourself to them will never surface it. First principles reasoning is the only method that can find that error, and the entire value of the method is concentrated in those rare cases. So the trait isn't intelligence. It's a willingness to pay an enormous ongoing cognitive tax on the chance that one of the things everyone knows is false. And there's a cost to running this permanently that rarely gets discussed. A mind that refuses inherited conclusions in one domain tends to refuse them everywhere, including domains where the inherited conclusion is correct and hard-won. The same reflex that identifies an arbitrary price in aerospace will just as confidently override a medical consensus, a legal norm, or a piece of institutional knowledge that exists precisely because someone already made the mistake. The method has no built-in mechanism for telling you which conventions are arbitrary and which are load-bearing. It just dissolves them all and asks you to rebuild. And you will rebuild some of them worse. That is not a footnote to the trait. It is the trait, seen from the other side. Which brings us to the second component, and this is where most people misread the pattern completely. He has said publicly that he assessed both his rocket company and his car company as more likely to fail than succeed. He put the odds at roughly 1 in 10 each, and funded them anyway, with essentially all of his money from a previous exit. The standard reading of this is that he is a risk taker, that he enjoys danger, that he has some unusual appetite for the thrill of it. I think that reading is wrong, and the distinction matters enormously if you're trying to learn anything from it. Look at what the decision actually contains. He did not believe he would probably win. He calculated that he would probably lose. He proceeded because he judged the outcome of losing to be survivable, and the outcome of winning to be enormous and asymmetric. That is not risk appetite. That is a specific tolerance for the emotional experience of probable failure, the ability to walk towards something believing it will not work. Almost nobody can do this, and the reason is not courage, it's that the human nervous system treats anticipated failure as a present tense threat. Most people are not stopped by the odds. They are stopped by how the odds feel to hold in their body for years at a time. The third component is the one that draws the most criticism, and I think the criticism is both correct and incomplete. His timelines are famously, consistently wrong. Full self-driving has been roughly a year away for over a decade. Production targets slip, launch dates move. This is well documented, and it is not in serious dispute. Psychologists have a name for this. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky described the planning fallacy in the late 1970s. The robust, replicated finding that people systematically underestimate how long their own projects will take, even when they have direct experience of similar projects running long. It is one of the most reliable biases in the literature. Everyone has it. The interesting question is not whether he has it. It's whether, at extreme magnitude, the bias stops functioning purely as an error. Consider what an impossible deadline does inside an organization. A realistic timeline gets met by doing the work the normal way. An impossible one cannot be met by the normal way, which means the only paths to it involve deleting steps, questioning requirements, or redesigning the process. The deadline is missed, but the search it forced produces methods that a realistic deadline never would have surfaced. So the same trait generates two outputs simultaneously: a genuine and repeated failure of forecasting, and a genuine forcing function that compresses timelines below what anyone else achieves. Both are true. Most commentary picks one and pretends the other isn't there. The fourth component shows up in a decision that looked, at the time, like straightforward mismanagement. Building factories for components other companies would happily sell you is more expensive, slower, and harder than buying them. Every business textbook says specialize and outsource. The pattern in the public record is a consistent refusal to do this. Batteries, engines, avionics, seats, software. Read as a business strategy, it's inefficient. Read as a threat model, it's coherent. Every supplier is an entity whose priorities are not yours, whose timeline you do not control, and who can become a hard ceiling on how fast you move. Vertical integration is expensive in money and cheap in dependency. It is a decision to pay cash to avoid being blocked. There's a second-order effect here that's easy to miss. When you build the component yourself, you also learn what it actually costs and what actually constrains it, which means you can then apply first principles reasoning to it. A supplier's price is opaque. Your own production line is not. So each act of vertical integration converts an unquestionable external number into an internal one you can attack. The two components compound. The refusal to depend feeds the machinery that finds the arbitrary constraints, because you cannot interrogate a cost structure you can't see. This is why the pattern looks like stubbornness from outside and looks like information gathering from inside. And the fifth component is the one that ties the others together, because none of them make sense without a reason to be running at that intensity for 25 years. The public reasoning has been consistently framed around existential risk, extending human presence beyond one planet, treating advanced AI as a serious danger, sustainable energy as a race against a deadline. Whatever you make of the specifics, the structure is identifiable. The motivation is not aspirational. It's a catastrophe being outrun. This matters mechanically. Aspiration is a weak fuel. It competes with comfort, and comfort usually wins after a decade. Threat is a strong fuel, because a nervous system that believes something is coming does not require motivation to keep moving. It simply cannot stop. That is why this profile sustains effort at levels that look inhuman, and it is also why the effort has no natural endpoint, no arrival, no moment where the thing is finished. Which brings us to the paradoxes, because a system built this way cannot be adopted piecewise. The first is that the trait producing the breakthroughs and the trait producing the failures are the same trait. You cannot keep first principles reasoning and discard the wrongness. The method's value comes from being willing to be wrong in public, repeatedly, against consensus. Remove that, and you have removed the mechanism. The second is that the tolerance for probable failure that makes enormous bets possible is the same tolerance that makes a normal life difficult. A person who can hold years of anticipated loss without flinching is not running a nervous system optimized for contentment. The third is that the threat orientation, which supplies unlimited fuel, also guarantees the fuel never runs out, which sounds like an advantage until you notice it means there is no version of the future in which this person gets to stop. So what does this actually leave us with? I think the honest answer is that this is not a template, and the enormous genre of content presenting it as one is selling something that doesn't exist. What's here is a set of trade-offs, each of which buys extraordinary capability at a specific and non-negotiable price. But one piece does transfer, and it's the smallest one. The Moscow spreadsheet did not require unusual intelligence. It required asking whether a number that everyone treated as fixed was actually fixed. That question is available to anyone, costs nothing, and most people go their entire lives without directing it at a single constraint they've accepted. You probably don't need the rest of the operating system. You might just need the spreadsheet.